Herzlich willkommen bei einer neuen Ausgabe unserer Interviewreihe Sterbeforschung aktuell.
Welcome to a new episode of our series Thanatology Up to Date. Today we will talk about whether near-death experiences can have a long-lasting effect on people's lives. Again, medical doctor Reto Eberhard Rast is by my side. He's the president of Swiss Ions, an organization whose aim is to inform people about near-death experiences. Dr. Eberhard, you've heard many reports on near-death experiences. It is always an experience that just takes a few minutes. However, in some cases, this experience seems to completely change the life of the person concerned. Is this an exception, or do near-death experiences generally have such a huge impact on people?
Well, by the way people have told me things, I could evaluate it from my personal viewpoint, but there have been done studies too that verify that quite well. It is astonishing how huge the after effect of near-death experiences is, because they sometimes just take a few seconds. For example, if somebody falls. Albert Heim was the one who did this first study. He was so astonished that he'd only fallen a few seconds, but what he had experienced while falling felt like 10 days or so. Or Mrs. Dreyer, who you interviewed some time ago. She was covered by an avalanche for about 30 minutes, and she speaks of 3 years. Maybe there's even a correlation of how long the experience takes, but this is just a hypothesis. I don't think this has been examined yet. However, it is very astonishing that something that only takes a few seconds has such a huge impact on people. But maybe we overestimate this a little bit when we think that only near-death experiences have that effect on people. Also, people who didn't have a near-death experience but barely escaped death can change their personality. I've experienced that a lot in a doctor's office. Somebody who had a serious illness, for example a tumor, and who was healed, would most probably assess life differently afterwards, and I think this is quite comparable to a near-death experience.
In how far can people change after such an experience? What cases are known to you?
You mean, what are the typical aspects of a change of personality? One thing I've heard quite frequently is appreciation. People appreciate their life, the environment, the people. They just appreciate them more. And this has a lot of consequences for everybody that aren't always that easily implemented, that we live this appreciation, that we shouldn't let small things that happen in our daily life get us down. It seems that people are more aware of these things. They also try to live philanthropy more. There are also, relatively speaking, many stats and studies about this, that people who've had a near-death experience become more spiritual. This doesn't necessarily mean that they become more religious. Oftentimes, they even leave institutional religiosity, such as going to church, and they tend to go more towards living a personal spirituality. And ultimately, they lose the fear of death, which is quite positive. These things might sound very easy. However, near-death experiences can be very hard. What I mean is how people cope with it or integrate it into their lives, and it can burden people for years. Many people experience this contrast of having lived in a different reality that was so comforting and loving, and so they can't really deal with this grey reality of the world down here anymore. Or sometimes, they talk about having an extension of themselves which they had during their out-of-body experience, and now they feel constricted in their own body because they've become more sensitive. Moreover, there are also paranormal phenomena where people have had, let's say, visions of the future. This isn't so easy to cope with, and there are people who'd like to give this up freely.
As
a layperson, one would say that these long-term impacts are a good indication that a near-death experience is something that isn't like a dream or a hallucination. What is your opinion?
I tend to see it that way as well. I think it is an indication, even if it is quite weak, but it has a certain value. I think there are other factors that are more significant though. However, the fact that was just mentioned is still significant. At the same time, I remember an evening at Swiss Ions where we talked about near-death experiences. And an older man got up and said that near-death experiences reminded him a lot of his LSD trips. When he was young, he took this. This was probably around 1968. And then he drove to the mountains, and there the grass seemed so cute to him. The rain was so beautiful. And that experience was quite special. I'm certain that people have experiences caused by drugs that can have a similar effect as a near-death experience. People just see it as a nice trip, but that's it. And generally speaking, people who have had a near-death experience are so convinced by their experience, so they don't have to answer the question to themselves whether a near-death experience was like a dream or a hallucination. They are so convinced that what they experienced was the reality of the hereafter, so that they don't really think about these aspects. This question is a lot more interesting to people who haven't made this experience. They look for confirmation or the hereafter, and they do that by taking a look at near-death experiences. This question comes up a lot, but not necessarily by people who have had this experience.
A few seconds can change a person's life completely. Thank you very much for this interview.